The 1948 Arab War against Israel, an aftershock of World War II, by Matthias Küntzel. There's a little introduction here. Matthias Küntzel's new book, Nazis, Islamic Anti-Semitism in the Middle East, explores the still underanalyzed impact of Nazi anti-Semitism on the development of Islamic anti-Semitism and the Arab world's 1948 war against the Jewish state. Here he introduces the book's central discoveries and arguments. Is there any connection between... Okay, now I'm starting the text. Is there any connection between the Nazi war of extermination against the Jews that ended in May 1945 and the war of the Arab armies against Israel, which started in May 1948? It's an obvious question, but one that is rarely asked. Why? The answer is because, at least this is my assumption, the provable existence of threads of continuity between 1945 and 1948 calls into question cherished certainties. For example, the conviction that the Arab movement against Zionism in Israel had nothing to do with the Nazi fantasies of the previous phase, and that Israel, i.e. Jews, were mainly responsible for the 1948 war and anti-Semitism in the region. My new book, Nazism, Islamic Anti-Semitism in the Middle East, challenges this conventional wisdom. It offers a new interpretation of the origins of the Arab-Israel War of 1948. The central role of Nazi anti-Semitism in the planning and implementation of the Shoah is well known. The impact of that same Nazi anti-Semitism on the Middle East, on the other hand, remains gravely under-researched. My book aims to fill this gap to the extent currently possible. It sets forth the methods used by Nazi Germany from 1937 onwards to disseminate its anti-Semitism in the Middle East in the Arabic language, and the role that this anti-Semitism would play 11 years later when the Arab armies fell upon the newly founded Jewish state of Israel. The fateful war triggered the Palestinian refugee catastrophe that has marked the Middle East conflict ever since. The spread of anti-Semitism in the Middle East did have something to do with the Zionist movement and the building of the Jewish state. There was, however, more than one way to respond to these developments. There were, for example, Egyptians who welcomed the, quote, victory of the Zionist idea, bracket, as, end bracket, the turning point for the revival of the Orient, end quote. Others, such as the ruler of Transjordan, Emir Abdullah, sought sometimes more, sometimes less cooperation with the Zionists. A third group may have opposed Zionism, but not Judaism, while initially it was only the supporters of the Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, who adopted the anti-Semitic approach. The Nazis exclusively backed this last group. They saw the clashes in Palestine as an opportunity to promote their form of Jew hatred and to impose an anti-Semitic interpretation on the local conflict. Only in recent years has the significance of the Nazis' Arabic language propaganda in the Arab world been brought to light, notably through the pioneering work of Jeffrey Herf. In 2009, he introduced us to the content of the manuscripts of the Nazis' Arabic language broadcast in his book, Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World. 5 years later, David Motadel published further important findings in his study, Islam and Nazi Germany's War. Building on these studies, the current book presents a series of new facts that have the potential to change our view of the past and the present of the Middle East conflict. 1937. Judaism and Islam. Firstly, I set out what is currently known about the origin and dissemination of the pamphlet Islam and Judaism, which was first published in 1937 in Cairo in order to derail plans for a two-state solution for Palestine. It is a shocking text that uses religion for the sole purpose of inciting Jew hatred. Islam and Judaism is significant because it is, as far as we know, the very first document to construct a continuity between Muhammad's confrontation with the Jews in Medina and the contemporary conflict in Palestine, thus linking the 7th to the 20th century. It is the first written evidence for what I call Islamic anti-Semitism and the forerunner of Sayyid Qutb's 1950 pamphlet called Our Struggle with the Jews. Islam and Judaism concludes with the following words, quote, "The verses from the Quran and Hadith prove to you that the Jews have been the bitterest enemies of Islam and continue to try to destroy Islam. Do not believe them. They only know hypocrisy and cunning. Hold together. Fight for the Islamic thought. Fight for your religion and your existence. Do not rest until your land is free of the Jews." End quote. Quote, "Free the Jews," quote, Judenfrei, is a typical Nazi expression which we do not find in early Islamic writings. Excuse me, free of the Jews. Why did I say free the Jews? Free of the Jews. Judenfrei is a typical Nazi expression which we do not find in early Islamic writing. The first Arabic version of Islam and Judaism was published in August 1937 in Cairo by the director of the Palestinian Arab Bureau of Information in Egypt, who is believed to have had many contacts with Nazi agents. In 1938, a German version of Islam and Judaism was published in Berlin under the title Islam Judaism, Call of the Grand Mufti to the Islamic World in 1937. Finally, during the Second World War, this brochure was printed and distributed in large numbers by German forces and translated into several languages. A translation of this document appears as an appendix to my book. The very date of the pamphlet's publication and dissemination, 11 years before the foundation of Israel, and 30 years before Israel's assumption of control in Gaza and the West Bank, is important. It contradicts the widespread assumption that Islamic anti-Semitism developed as a response to alleged Israeli misdeeds. It was not the behavior of the Zionists that prompted the publication of this hostile text, but rather the very first attempt to implement a two-state solution for Palestine. This fact suggests that Jew hatred was a cause, not a consequence of the crises in the Middle East conflict. 1938/39. Goebbels and the Muslim Brotherhood. Secondly, I present new archival discoveries relating to the collaboration between German Nazi agents and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Documents from the British National Archive reveal that this collaboration was known about at the highest levels in Germany, and that according to one note, Goebbels, has spoken about it with much praise, end quote. Nazi agents not only transferred money to the Muslim Brotherhood, but also attended conferences of this organization, held common, quote, Palestine meetings, end quote, with it, and gave lectures to its members on the, quote, Jewish question, end quote. After 1945, this Nazi operation paid off when that very same Muslim Brotherhood, now grown into an influential mass movement, pushed the Arab rulers into war against Israel. 1939 to 1945, Arabic language radio propaganda. Thirdly, I analyzed the 6 years of anti-Semitic radio propaganda in Arabic that the Nazis broadcast from the small town of Season, near Berlin, which unlike the written text could reach the Arab masses. Back then, listening to the radio was a public affair. The men listened to it at the bazaar, in marketplaces, and in coffee houses. The content of the programs would become the dominant topic of conversation, multiplying their impact. This is what the British Secret Service reported on the impact of Radio Season. In general, it may be said that the middle, and lower classes listened to the Arabic broadcasts from Berlin with a good deal of enjoyment. This is a quote. Quote, in general, it may be said that the middle, and lower classes listened to the Arabic broadcasts from Berlin with a great deal of enjoyment. Good deal of enjoyment. They like the racy, quote, juicy stuff, which is put over. What the average Palestine Arab does imbibe, however, is the anti-Jew material. This he wants to hear and to believe, and he does both. To that extent, German propaganda is definitely effective, end quote. The, quote, anti-Jew material, end quote, was effective because the Nazis could build on the patterns of early Islamic anti-Judaism and instrumentalize the local conflict with the Zionists. In addition, the BBC and other Allied broadcasters gave in to the Nazis by failing directly to challenge their anti-Jewish incitement. None of them wanted to be seen as defenders or even, quote, accomplices, end quote, of the Jews, thus confirming aspects of the Nazi propaganda. My book shows that in retrospect, those 6 years of daily radio propaganda marked a turning point, dividing Middle Eastern history into a, quote, before, end quote, and an, quote, after. These years worsened the image of the Jews in the Arab world. They fostered an exclusively anti-Jewish reading of the Quran. They popularized the European world conspiracy myths. They shaped a genocidal rhetoric towards Zionism. A consequence of this propaganda was that by 1948, large swaths of the Arab public viewed a Jewish state as a mortal threat that had to be violently destroyed. 1944. Weapons, quote, for the battles to follow, end quote. Fourthly, I describe certain measures taken by the Nazis in 1944/45 to prepare for the forthcoming war against Israel. With their own defeat looming, they wished to preserve their anti-Semitic legacy by taking steps to prevent the future establishment of a Jewish state. Thus, in his memoirs, Amin al-Husseini, the former Mufti of Jerusalem, relates that in October 1944, the Wehrmacht provided aircraft to store ammunition and weapons in Palestine as, quote, preparations for the days after the end of World War II, end quote, for their preparation for the battles to follow, end quote. On the 6th of October, 1944, 5 Nazi parachutists did indeed fly out from Athens to land in the Jordan valleys with the task of hiding crates of weapons that they had previously dropped from the plane. 10 days later, they were captured by the British. While this may have been an isolated and ineffective action, it nonetheless provides a direct link between the Nazis' World War and the, quote, battles to follow, end quote, in Palestine. 1947/1948. Arab hesitation, Islamist mobilization. Fifthly, my book shows that Arab attitudes towards Zionism were less monolithic than has often been assumed. Thus, already in 1937, there were many Arabs who supported the two-state solution for Palestine. Admittedly, the Arab League unanimously opposed the two-state solution for Palestine advocated by the United Nations in 1947. Even so, how to react to this decision was disputed until the last minute. On several occasions, the Arab League ruled out the possibility of an attack by regular Arab forces on the Jewish state. Egypt, for example, questioned this war, which began on May 15, 1948, only a few days before it began. Quote, we shall never even contemplate entering an official war, end quote, declared General Muhammad Haidar, Egypt's defense minister, in the beginning of May 1948. Quote, we are not mad, end quote. Why did a, quote, official war, end quote, against Israel nevertheless take place? My book provides evidence that it was primarily pressure from the, quote, Arab street, end quote, and the anti-Semitic campaigns of the Muslim Brotherhood that led the Arab rulers to overcome all their doubts and attack Israel. In 1948, the Muslim Brotherhood was the largest anti-Semitic movement in the world, with 1 million members. It was determined to continue the war to prevent a Jewish state started by Hitler and Mufti. It was determined to continue the war to prevent a Jewish state started by Hitler and the Mufti. Its campaign could draw on the lingering echoes of the anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda in which preventing the emergence of a Jewish state and wiping out the Jews living in Palestine had been constant themes. The war was not inevitable. It took place despite many countervailing considerations because the Nazis' anti-Semitic Arab language propaganda had shaped the post-war political climate. In this feverish atmosphere, no Arab leader felt able to successfully resist the Brotherhood's warmongering. There are, therefore, good grounds for interpreting the Arab war against Israel as a kind of aftershock of the previous Nazi war against the Jews. Amin al-Husseini embodied the continuity of the two events. His religiously packaged anti-Semitism, which had cost thousands of Jews their lives in 1944, was 4 years later directed against Israel. Why the ignorance? So why then is the role of Nazi propaganda and Nazi policies largely ignored in debates on the roots of anti-Semitism in the Middle East? A plausible hypothesis is that the pattern of omission reflects a desire to protect a proposition that is accepted as dogma in many academic circles. The idea that Israel, i.e. Jews, bear sole responsibility not only for the war in 1948, but also the anti-Semitism in the region. Claims such as, quote, the spread of anti-Semitism in the Arab-Islamic world as the consequence of the Palestine conflict, end quote, are widespread. From this paradigm, numerous Middle East experts derive mitigating circumstances for Arabs' anti-Semitism. From this paradigm, numerous Middle East experts derive mitigating circumstances for Arab anti-Semitism. Quote, it is the fantasy-based hatred of the Jews that was and still is typical of European racists, the equivalent of the hatred felt by Arabs enraged by the occupation and or destruction of Arab lands, end quote. Is the rhetorical question of the British-Lebanese anti-Zionist Gilbert Achcar, quote, Arab anti-Semitism, in contrast to European anti-Semitism, is at least based on a real problem, namely the marginalization of the Palestinians, end quote, insists German Islam researcher Jochen Müller. This paradigm, which distinguishes between a Nazi-like European anti-Semitism and a, quote, at least, end quote, understandable hatred of Jews in the Middle East, hides the Nazi influence on the image of Jews held by many Muslims in the Middle East. And it has political consequences. The basic assumption that anti-Semitism in the Arab-Islamic world is merely a response to Israel and can therefore be downplayed as a kind of local custom is one of the foundations of German and European Middle East policy and may be one of the reasons why the latter refuses to decisively combat the Jew hatred of, for example, Hezbollah or the Iranian regime. It is, however, necessary to understand how strongly modern Middle East history is shaped by the aftermath of National Socialism. Only then will we be able to properly understand and adequately counter the anti-Semitism in this region and its echo among Muslims in Europe and address the political realities of the Middle East realistically and effectively. The end.